Welcome to Cocktails and Crime Analysis. My name is Charlie Gibberti, and we have really big news to start this episode off. We fired Chris. Jason and I had to call him into Cocktails and Crime Analysis corporate office earlier this week, and we sat him down and we said, Chris, the numbers just aren't working out, man. We got to go with somebody else. So I'd like to welcome to the
Everybody
show for
hates
the
Chris.
very first time. Everybody does hate Chris. You know, we got some
Chris.
survey
Everybody
information
hates
back that
Chris.
said he wasn't that handsome, so we had to let him go. So I'd like to introduce for the very first time as our third co-host, Cassie Langdon. Cassie comes to us from Holly Springs, North Carolina. So Cassie, for the first time I'll ask you, what are you drinking?
I am drinking Crown Apple and ginger ale.
Oh.
Sounds like a very
Simple.
classy drink.
Thank you.
Yeah. Jason, what about you, man? What you drinking?
I am drinking a pink mule. So it's a
Oh,
Moscow mule made with grapefruit juice.
Ooh,
no
healthy.
Sparkle Donkey this week?
No sparkle donkey. I save that for only certain occasions.
Well, as you guys can see, I'm actually on location this week at the beautiful Fort Lauderdale beach for the FCIA conference. So I am drinking the official drink of Florida. This is Hunch Punch. No one actually knows what's in Hunch Punch. Some say it's just whatever's in your heart. If you play a Jimmy Buffett song backwards, it'll tell you how to make it. So, so
Solid.
cheers. Thank you guys for joining for the show today. So, some big announcements in the crime analysis training world. Eric Pisa, friend of the show, big GIS expert, is launching a training program specifically for crime analysts through Northeastern University. The program is a series of 1 hour, 1 credit hour classes as part of a certificate program that can be taken asynchronously. It is geared towards working professionals. So in honor of Eric launching his class, I wanted to start today off by just asking you guys, what is the best training that you've ever been through as a crime analyst? Cassie, we'll start with you.
So mine is actually going to be the Essentials training through IACA. It's one of the 12-week online classes because, one, I could really go at my own pace and kind of take in as much as I wanted. And you have the whole book, so even though the first Essentials kind of only goes over like the first half of the book, I saw the book and kind of went on. And it really helped set up a base with the data part of crime analysis when I was transitioning from really working as an investigator in that intel side to know what I was talking about.
Do they use Exploring Crime Analysis in that class? Is that the book?
Yeah.
We might have some big announcements related to Exploring Crime Analysis a little bit later in the year. We'll see about that. Jason, what
Yeah.
about you? Best training you've ever been through?
I can't remember the name of the training, which is might be bad, but it's the concept I think that counts. And so I'm going back a ways because I'm old man elder. So we might be talking about 20 years ago, actually. It might have been 2005, 2004, 2005. Can't remember exactly. But I was working in Maryland at the time, and the state police had put on a couple-day training set for anybody that's was local that could come to their training facility. And they had a detective from New York City come down, and he essentially taught me how to write a subpoena in terms of
No.
telephone records and all the ways that you could ask for data, and if legal in your state, how to cast a wider net to get more than just maybe some subscriber information. And what was particularly great about that training is when I got back to the office after that training, it changed the way I did business. It was something that I implemented right away. I changed the way that because I would, at the time, I would be putting together a lot of the language in the subpoenas for call detail records or subscriber information. So with doing that, I instantly was able to improve my job after going to that training.
As a money laundering analyst, this is like my number one irritation with investigators. They all, for some reason, think that they just have to write a generic subpoena and just take data however it is somebody wants to give it to you. And I get on them all the time. I'm like, no, you can say this data has to be in a spreadsheet. You can't just send me a photocopy of a document. And it would make my life so much easier, bro.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I totally get
Here's
that.
500 receipts. Have fun.
Yeah,
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah. I spent plenty of time scanning in hard copies and trying to clean telephone records in my day. And yeah, that's not a fun task to do.
I went through, man, I guess it's been like 2018 or so. The Department of Justice Money Laundering Asset Recovery section has a training section, and all they do is once a month they go to a different city in the U.S. and they put on a 2-day introduction to money laundering seminar. And that class completely changed the course of my career. It's really cool because you, first of all, you're in there with a whole bunch of other, mostly federal uh, intelligence analysts and agents, and they put on a series of videos where they show you events that happen, and then based on those events, you have to then go do some sort of analytical work. So it's kind of like watching an investigation unfold and in real time. So that you practice things like making an asset list, querying FinCEN, subpoenaing bank accounts, and writing subpoenas and things like that. And at the end, you have to make link charts and show where all the money went and what's suitable for seizure and what isn't. You have to understand the legalities of it. And that training is actually still going on. And if you work inside a law enforcement agency, DOJ will let you attend. Typically, you have to travel to go there for a couple days or whatever, but it's entirely free. So
Nice.
could not, if you've got $4,000 to spend, that means you can take Eric Pisa's certification class and go through the DOJ MLARS training all in
It's a
the
pretty
same
good
month.
bargain.
Nice.
Yeah, can't
Yeah,
beat that.
that's a good return. So, well,
So,
can we go a little bit opposite? I was just thinking of training that I didn't like so much. And we're allowed
Oh
to do
yeah.
yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Let's hate on somebody. Let's do it.
Um, and so, and I'll go first since I'm bringing it up to give you all some time to gather your thoughts. But probably around the same time period. I'm talking about 2005, 2006. Our whole office got invited to DC for, I think it was DEA at the time, was putting on their fleet training. And this training was normally 6 weeks that you went to, but somehow they crammed this thing into 2 weeks. And for 2 straight weeks, we got nothing but lectured to, and there was 2 days that actually were 10 hours long. And it was just one talking head after another. And there were some of them gave some pretty good tips and tricks and about investigations and trying to they did some fun things about handwriting analysis and if someone's lying and whatnot. And so those are some things that I do remember. But in terms of like what I brought back to the office, I mean, I was spent like 5 or 6 days into the training, and it was a 10-day training, as I mentioned. So that was one of those things that I was burnt by the time we got it, and I don't really think there was too much that I grabbed from that 2 weeks and actually implemented when I got back to the office.
Mine isn't like a specific one because this has happened to me a couple times. I hate going into a training that says it's going to teach you this skill and you get in there and it's just a case study essentially, but not a well done case study. It's more of a look at me and how I solved this case and did this great thing. But you don't realize that until you're like in it. And I'm not one of those people that'll get up and leave. Um, I will stick through it, even if they're like just doing miserable. I can't. So yeah, you're just sitting there and you're hearing this I love me story for however long of a period, depending on whether it's a conference or a specific training. But there's one I was stuck in for 2 hours. It was rough. I learned nothing.
Do you guys feel that case studies are training?
No.
I think it has to be very particularly done. If you're walking through the skill set in a way, more than just like broad highlights of what happened in the case. But I think the way it's generally done, no.
Yeah. I often feel, I mean, it's a staple, I think, at a lot of conferences to have whole tracks dedicated to case studies. And I think it's like the true crime phenomenon where people like a good story, so they'll sit there and listen to a good story. But in terms of, again, you can tell what I feel is good training is something that you can bring back and implement back into your office. And I'm not, some of those case studies, I mean, maybe there's something that they did in that particular training that you could key on and either ask them about, study up on, and implement. But I'm not sure how many people are doing that.
Yeah, I think I've one out of all the ones I've sat through have taught me something specifically.
There are some conferences that do this really well. So ACFE had the guy who went to jail for the Fire Festival as like a well-known fraudster, like coming up, and they also had the investigator that made the case against him. They were like on stage together talking about what happened. That room was packed. There must have been at least 1,200 people in that room, and it was so much fun to listen to. But like, short of having something really fascinating like that, yeah, there are events that I won't go to anymore because I just know every year it's just case study after case study after case study. And once you've been in law enforcement for 5 years, like these things just aren't as interesting as they
Yeah.
used to be. Like there was another murderer, you got him with cool technology, awesome. Like
Yeah.
I don't know. You're right. There's just nothing. But also, I do want to give them a little bit of slack because, like Jason, to your point, when it's supposed to be like a 10-week class and they boiled it down to 6 or whatever, teaching hard skills at events is really difficult because one, they're boring, and then two, it's also like for a long time I was like the automation guy, right? So these conferences would be like, "Hey, we want you to come talk about automation," and I'd agree to do it, and they'd say, "Great, you have an hour." And I'm like, to teach automation, like just all automation. That's like saying, I don't know, you have an hour to teach people computers, like everything there is to be about computers. Like and it's tough to get people to sit down for 5 days and like focus on one skill. That's just not as much
Yeah.
in demand. I will tell you that I'm always like super sympathetic to presenters, like especially if they're clearly nervous and they're like, yeah, like I won't get up and leave the room either. The thing that drives me crazy is when somebody says, "This is an advanced class," and then you get in there and it's clearly not. Like
Yeah.
and I don't want to stereotype, but it tends to almost always be Excel is the subject matter, and it tends to always be someone of a generation that did not grow up with computers saying, "Look at how advanced this is."
I made a pivot table.
Right. It's like we there is no standardized agreed upon definition of what is advanced and what is not. So I understand, but man, so many times I look at those classes and it's like advanced Power BI, learn how to write formulas, and it's like, is that really going to be advanced? I don't know.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it's frustrating to go in there thinking you're going to be challenged or thinking you're going to learn something new, and the person's just like, so yeah, you can highlight a column by clicking here, and then you can drag, and like, that's tough. All right, well, once you go to those great trainings and a few bad ones, and you get some skills, inevitably you're going to need to go find a job. Jason, you and Mindy released a podcast actually earlier today as we're filming this, going through a couple of different job postings, and I kind of wanted to revisit that conversation because both of you guys, all three of us, have not only been working at a police department, but we've gone to a few. So we've spent our time looking for jobs, and we've gone to places and it didn't work out, so we've gone other places. So with the benefit of all of your experience, when you guys look at a job posting or when you're in an interview, what stand out to you as like the biggest things that you look for and also the biggest red flags?
Yeah, so starting with the job posting itself, the two biggest things, and I noticed this even recently, one, it's overly vague. So the crime analyst role seems like it's been copied and posted from like either just like the IACA website or just very broad of what you're going to be doing isn't clear. Or two, they're overly specific about programs, but you can tell that they probably don't know what that program is. So, for example, there was a very small agency that had stated Palantir was one of the products that they were using. The analyst was going to be in charge of, and
Nope.
I instantly was like, there's no way that you have Palantir. If you do, I'm going to be amazed. But clearly they like Googled crime analyst, products and technology, and they posted it in their posting. So yeah, outliers on both extremes, really.
Yeah, so Mindy and I did go through four, really just at random. And it was fascinating. The intelligence analyst one that we reviewed was the most specific. And it got me thinking that it's probably because that position's written into the standard operating procedure. And it's very specific in terms of the duties because it went into doing research in CAD and working cameras and doing LPR, which is it was way more specific. And the crime analysis ones that we reviewed, to Cassie's point, were very general. Like report report on stats or report on do weekly presentations or something like that. Do some crime trends or something like that. Um, I don't. I think there are some things you look for. What can you build off of? If you decide you're applying for this job, how can you apply your skills to the job? And so that's what I would be looking for is is there preferred education? Is there preferred certification? How do I see myself being able to highlight my experience with what they're trying to highlight? And that's more general than maybe what you were thinking of, Charlie, but that's what comes to mind.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily know that I want to unpack this a lot, and I try not to use this as a platform to throw shade. But any job posting that mentions frickin' crystal reports, I would just immediately delete. Just like, no, like I deserve better than that in my life. Like, and I'm not saying I'm not endorsing that there's a better thing out there or whatever. Just like literally any, or Tyler Technologies. If you have to touch Tyler Technologies, go give yourself a crime analysis like inoculation before you take that job. Um,
So Crystal Reports in particular is a sore spot for me because I tell folks that I didn't get to go to Disneyland because of Crystal Reports. Okay? IACA, whatever year that was, 2017, 2018, when it was in Redlands, I put in to do SQL, to do 2 SQL classes, and both of them got denied because they wanted to do Crystal Reports over just normal SQL. And so me and my family are deprived of Disneyland because of Crystal Reports.
if you needed another reason to hate Crystal Reports,
Yeah.
what an evil corporation stepped into Jason Elder's lives and robbed his children of Disneyland. God.
Yes. So.
I think for me, the line that I have fallen for in the past, but I recognize now that it's super freaking toxic, is if you are dealing with a police chief and they say, this job can be anything you want to make it. That sounds super progressive and awesome. It's not. I promise you it's not. Jason, kind of like what you were saying about the job that was really specific because it's written into SOPs.
Mm-hmm.
I still think that a majority of police departments today, I don't know what the impetus for hiring an analyst is in the first place, but if it's something like a captain or a chief saw a news report about something crime analysis related and said, we need to do that. And so they flew through the process, they hired somebody, and there's no standard operating procedure, there was no forethought on how that person's going to get used, and then they bring them in for an interview and they say something like, this job can be anything you want to make it. Well, let me tell you what's going to happen. You're going to get there. No one's going to really know what to tell you to do. If you're a seasoned analyst and you can sit and you can start building an analytic function, cool. If that's not, you're going to get tossed from one administrative duty to another. You're going to wind up in a real-time crime center. You're going to wind up in a fusion center. You're going to wind up doing phones. You're going to wind up doing drones. And maybe some of those things are cool. Maybe you're into it. Maybe that's your
Yeah.
passion, but you're probably not going to be sitting down doing the job that you thought that you were going to be doing
Yeah.
in 6 months, a year, however long it is.
That's very fair because I've fallen for that line twice now. But the
We've
first
all been there.
time, there had been a history of analysts there before, and there were people within the building that understood what crime analysts do, just not all of command staff. And of course, then, command staff changes and you end
Right.
up at a real-time crime center, not doing analysis. But yeah, it very much depends on the agency, and like you said, like being seasoned versus non-seasoned. So you go into a small department that's like, we need this now, and you're new, or like maybe you only have a couple months, or maybe you have your degree in crime analysis, and you get there. One, you've got to be able to hold your own. So when people start coming in and saying, "Hey, I need you to do this," and you're like, "No, I'm not a PIO." Like, you have to have the ability to do that.
Not a
that being
secretary.
yeah, not a secretary. So not only being a seasoned analyst, but being able to hold your own against command staff, which can be intimidating when someone of rank comes in there and says, "Hey, I need you to do this," and I'm like, "Well, I would love to help you. However, this is my role, and this is where I'm going to spend my time. It's more beneficial to the department and why you hired me." So
Yeah.
it's a
And
balance.
and I've interviewed plenty of analysts that not only was that a new position, but they were brand new to the field. And some people flourish in that, right? Some people went in there and were able to learn the job, build the position, and the department was better for it. But it, just like anything else, it's not for everybody.
Yeah.
I struggled in similar when I was in similar positions where it's like, hey, you gotta show me some kind of architecture here. I can't just I mean, I'm not sure how I'm going to meet any goals if you're just telling me to just do whatever. And I always relied on my technical skills, right? Because of that. And some folks will maybe rely on something else, either their soft skills or there will be an extension of the investigator, or there's a wide path to go into, but it still surprises me to this day that in the 90s I get it because police departments were forced or felt forced to hire analysts to be CALIA certified. And so they just went through the thing. It's like, hey, we need this because we want to be certified. So yeah, we don't really know, so go. But in 2024, if you're putting in for a position and you're not sure what that position's supposed to do, it's a little surprising to me.
This is my broadcast to police departments that are trying to get CALIA certified that don't have an analyst. And maybe you're a smaller department. You don't need a whole analyst if you're just doing it for CALIA, right? It's like, I did the CALIA standard of crime analysis as the records person at Wrightsville Beach, right? It was a one-page document I put together once a month. So if that's all you're using it for, don't hire a crime analyst, right?
I think they tweaked that standard. In the 90s, it actually, I think, had to be someone with the analyst title. And I think they've tweaked that standard since then.
Well,
So you're right. It just has to have certain someone doing analytical duties will meet the standard now.
What did that one-page document contain? For those of us who have never done that.
So, in my non-analytical trained self, fresh out of college doing records, essentially had the 3-month stats for, I don't even know if we were technically NIBRS. I think we are still doing part 1, part 2 at the time. It's been a little while, can't remember. It had where our hot spots were. Remember, it's Wrightsville Beach, right? It's very, very small. So my hot spot was like this house. And then a forecasting of, hey, this is based on the previous years during this month. This is the crime that we tend to see an uptick in. So maybe have officers be on foot patrol an hour longer in the bar district, or move over to the residential areas during these hours. So Yep.
all things that with the right technical skill set, you could just have somebody come in and automate. And then you could have just anybody in the department click the button once a month to generate the thing.
Correct.
So yeah, you
Yep.
don't need a whole analyst for that.
Yep.
Back to job announcements, though, real quick. I know we want to move on to the next topic, but one of the things that we're going to get into, well, we might have to scratch that, but the talking about going into the private sector. When I was going into the private sector, the way I got the job that I have at Vanderbilt now is they were looking for a business intelligence analyst in their dashboard team. And they used a software called Excelsius. And I happened to use Excelsius for one project at Cincinnati Police Department because we had a deputy chief that wanted a dashboard badly. And so that was the quickest way for us to do that. It was for me to learn this Excelsius program. So when I saw that on the job announcement, that they were looking for somebody in dashboards and they were that Excelsius, I automatically adjusted my whole resume to highlight that project and to highlight that software and everything that basically I had learned. Because I was leaving law enforcement, so all the other stuff that I probably learned up until that point in terms of law enforcement didn't really apply. I mean, it was still data and it was still analysis in a way, but a lot of the law enforcement stuff was not as important. But I ended up getting the job, and it's been working well for me ever since. So just to point that out to listeners, to really those job announcements, if you can pick something out of there to work from, that's what those job announcements are for.
Yeah. Let's say moving past the announcement into the interview phase, you talked about the chief making, the comment of you can do whatever you want. Say another thing, if you're looking at your panel and if no one on your interview, if you're doing a panel, interview panel has any type of technical skill to really question your knowledge, or be able to, for you to ask technical questions, that to me is a red flag. Even at my
Huge.
most recent one, they didn't have an analyst, but they brought in the GIS person that had worked specifically with the police department and understood what I was talking about, and I could directly ask him questions, and that was great. They used the resources they had. He still understood the police department's data, so at least they were attempting, right? Making more of an effort than I've seen in other places.
40% of analysts that I've surveyed so far report that there was not anybody with any sort of analytical skill in any part of their interview process. Absolutely ridiculous to me because, like you said, even if you don't have an analyst in the police department, okay, an IT person, a GIS person, reach out to surrounding police departments and say, hey, can we borrow your analyst? Reach out to professional associations and say, hey, do you have somebody? Like, if you valued the input of analysts, about 30 seconds of forethought could help you overcome the fact that you don't have an analyst to put on that interview panel.
Another thing, it's also protecting the department, because you think about it, if you don't have anyone that has those technical skills and someone comes in and they're just really good at spewing it and they actually have no idea what they're talking about, you have no way to question that if you don't have someone with those skills in your panel.
I've thought that I've been doing these interviews before, and people will ask me questions just like, how would you disseminate information using Power BI or whatever? And I've looked around the panel and just be like, none of y'all motherfuckers know anything about this. Like, I could spin you guys a freaking tale right now. About, I'll just throw in words like, I'm going to put it in the cloud and I'm going to use Azure and there'll be AI. Yeah, cool AI. Yeah.
You gotta throw in a SQL server somehow.
Yeah,
there'll be servers and
Yeah.
And then you collate all the information.
Mm-hmm.
You got to collate, of course. Collation is super important. Yeah. I kind of splitting the difference between what you guys both talked about and like spinning a tale and also customizing your resume, because those are kind of similar. But I haven't, like in the past, there was a job that I decided I really wanted, but in the job posting, they specifically mentioned freaking Crystal Reports, and I was like, ugh. And I had used Crystal Reports at that point, but I was like, I don't really know. But it was like the only hard skill they mentioned, and so I wasn't a very good user of Crystal Reports. But I had 3 days in between whenever when I saw that job and when the job was actually due. So I just wrote Crystal Reports expert on my resume, and then I spent 3 days on Udemy just doing Crystal Reports classes. And like a lot of the very little of the world, like if they need a coder and you need to know Python and Java, don't do that. But if you already know Excel, if you already know ArcPro, and they're like, we need you to know Cognos, or we need you to know Power BI, like those are not things that you have to like go to a mountain in Tibet and sit with monks for years to learn. Like, give yourself 2 days to sit down with some videos and walk into that interview pretty confident.
Oh, that's the same thing I did for my job at Carey. On the thing, it said Power BI. I had never heard of Power BI. And I decided, I was like, all right. So I paid for the LinkedIn Premium that month so I could do whatever training and have a certificate. And I literally, during my interview, popped out the certificate. I was like, oh, yeah, I've even got a training certificate on this. I had no idea what I was doing. Basic Power BI, because law enforcement data and the rest of the world's data and Power BI are two different things.
But you guys hacking the system.
Yeah. Hey, now I really am good at Power BI, okay? It took some time to get there.
Right, of course, the implication was that you would actually be good, right?
Yeah.
We're not endorsing just spinning a tail, but yeah. All right, well, guys, Cassie, it's your first show with us, so we wanted to take some time to get to know you a little bit better. So I figured this would be a great opportunity for us to go around the table and declare for the whole world to hear what is your Harry Potter house. So, Cassie, we'll let you go first.
I think this would be no surprise to anybody that knows me. I am a Gryffindor, so yeah, you saw it.
Why? What makes you a Gryffindor?
So the big thing about Gryffindor is being brave, right? And I am one of those people that's... let's put it in a crime analysis field here. Not afraid to walk into the chief's office and tell him when something's wrong. You know, other people, like in command staff, so they see issues, they may oh, well, that might cause waves. But if it's for something productive and to make it a better, I'm going to deal with it. So.
Okay. Jason, you read up on the Harry Potters?
Old Man Elder hates to read. So,
What?
No, I don't read, and I've never read the books. So, I've watched the movies. I watched the movies with my nephews, and I really wish that I had a link chart with me when I was watching them, because they drop names on that thing left and right, and the big reveals and everything else is this monologue, and you have to keep up with all these names, and I kept whispering over to them, who's that? And then they said, we're not watching this in the theater with you. We're going to watch it at home this time, because we're going to pause it and then explain it to you and then unpause it, and we're not going to miss anything. So, but to answer your question, I am, based on the online quiz that I took years ago, I am Ravenclaw.
I would have guessed that about you.
Yeah.
What that means, but that's what the
minus the
online
fact
quiz
you don't
told
like
me.
to read. It's a little weird, but the rest
If you
of it
say
adds
things
up.
like, I was watching a movie and I really would have liked to have had a chart, you're definitely Ravenclaw.
That's so fair. That's so
It's a
fair.
Ravenclaw.
Okay.
Guilty as
Well, this
charged.
comes as a surprise to nobody, but I'm 100% Slytherin.
Do it.
Because
Called it.
I am the type of analyst that would sit next to Cassie and be like, you know what, something's really wrong. Someone should go talk to the chief, and she'll be like, oh, I'll do it, and I'll just be like, good job.
Yeah. It's the cunning, okay? You gotta...
Cunning, yeah.
Yeah.
We're cunning, we're
the
sly.
snake
we're
in the
scheming.
grass.
Yeah. 100% Slytherin. I don't know about all the racism and genocide and stuff, but man, those house parties were probably way cooler in Slytherin than anywhere else, and so that's what I'm here for. Speaking of house parties, Colin Whittington from across the thin blue line is going to be joining us right after this segment. He's going to be talking about his new book, wherein he discusses police officers transitioning to the private sector, something that a few people on this show have done. So we're going to go get a refill, and be sure to come back and join us. All right, so we are back. Our guest today is Colin Whittington from Recruiting Heroes. His first book, Beyond the Thin Blue Line, is out July 2nd of this year. The book is all about police officers transitioning to private sector jobs, which is obviously something some of the people on this podcast have talked about quite a bit, so we're really excited to have him. Colin, as always, we'll start out by just asking, what are you drinking?
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me. And tonight I'm drinking Blanton's whiskey. Got it for Christmas. I know, good stuff. I brought the good stuff for the show.
That's the reserve, too.
Yeah. So I live in Virginia, and it's really difficult to find here. And my wife somehow found it for me for Christmas. So I try to save it for special occasions. As you probably saw, I'm almost done the bottle, but figured it'd be good to bring it out for this podcast. So thanks so much for having me.
Are you drinking it straight from the bottle, or do you?
I know I do have a glass too. Yeah.
Oh,
no.
Okay. Just check it.
That's a good check. Yeah, absolutely. Got the glass.
Yeah, I am really jealous because I'm drinking Munyon's Papa.
Oh wow. Yeah.
More
Different
the
size of
premium
spectrum
lesser
there.
here in my Munyon's Mule.
I don't think I've had that before, but it does sound fantastic. Cheers to you.
It's not nearly as good, but you don't have to work half as hard to go get it. So
Right. Yes, absolutely.
So, Colin, why write a book specifically for police officers looking to transition to the private sector?
Yeah, so I actually was in law enforcement myself. I was a deputy sheriff in Northern Virginia for an agency called the Loudoun County Sheriff's Office, just outside D.C. Worked patrol, community policing, got promoted to sergeant, and then I was put in charge of the recruiting and background investigation unit, which is where I really fell in love with recruiting. Ended up leaving law enforcement in 2022 and starting my own recruiting agency. The company itself is called Recruiting Heroes, as you mentioned, and the company's mission is to help veterans and first responders, specifically law enforcement, find careers after their years of service. Specifically for law enforcement, I noticed there's a huge lack of resources for officers trying to leave law enforcement to go into the private sector. Where the military has things like the Transitions Assistance Program and numerous nonprofits, there really is nothing for law enforcement. I know when I left, there was absolutely no guidance for me. And speaking to hundreds of officers over the past 2 or 3 years, I realized that for them as well, they really are kind of thrown to the wolves and have no idea how to transition to the private sector. Many of them got into law enforcement, in their early 20s, sometimes even teens, depending on the agency and the state's laws. And some of them haven't written a resume, in 20 years or never written a resume. So they're now having to find a real job for the first time, right, after being a cop for 20-some years. It's a huge transition for them. And that really inspired me to start the company, and then also inspired me for this book itself, too. As soon as I started the company, I started as a side hustle, to be honest with you, never expecting it to take off on me. But it just snowballed and exploded on me. So I was able to leave my full-time job and make it a full-time company now as well. And I realized that I couldn't reach all the people I wanted to reach just one-on-one. So the book was a way that I could reach, thousands of officers across the country, maybe even the world potentially, that could learn from my experiences and hopefully benefit from this resource.
It's interesting you brought up the analogy of military. Do you feel like, having been in law enforcement, now you recruit people out of law enforcement, is there any pushback to that? Do people kind of look at you like you're the enemy?
Yeah, absolutely. A little bit for sure. Not so much on the actual officers who are trying to leave, but from their command staff for sure. A little bit of a looking down. A little bit of, obviously, law enforcement right now is going through a tough time with recruiting, with staffing. A lot of agencies have significant vacancies, so there is definitely a little bit of a feeling that trying to take officers away. And I actually mentioned this in my book that that's absolutely not what I'm trying to do. I say that if someone read my book and decided after reading it that they wanted to stay in law enforcement, I would be overjoyed that they decided to stay. We need the best men and women in this profession. It's such an important profession to keep our country safe, our community safe. But at the same time, if somebody knows that they either want to retire or want to leave law enforcement early, like I did, that it's in everyone's interest to help them in that process. We should only have officers on the force who really want to be there. And if you've served and realize your time there is done, you also deserve the chance to have a successful transition to the private sector and not just be confined to a lower level job or a job you're not passionate about.
Yeah, you talk about in your book about making that decision and how hard it can be to give up the badge and for the various reasons. And this is something that I've struggled with even myself. So where was the line for you? I know you kind of list out some different questions that, to ask your family and yourself. What was it for you?
Yeah, it was a tough decision. I really loved my time in law enforcement. I had a great career. I was actually named the Deputy of the Year for the whole state of Virginia in 2019, which was really freaking cool. Got a couple of other awards as well. Got promoted to sergeant after only 4.5 years, and had already tested for lieutenant and was poised to get promoted again. So I was doing really well in my career, but I just started getting a sense that I felt I was destined for something outside of law enforcement. Numerous reasons, not really one specific thing. I can't really point to one real call for service or one real moment where I knew I had what was done. It was just, the long hours, the pay wasn't fantastic. The national narrative surrounding law enforcement was taking a beating pretty hard during that time frame as well. And just thinking I wanted to see what else was out there. And it was a tough decision, though. It was really difficult. I mentioned in the book, too, how much I struggled with that decision to leave. And I really tried suppressing that feeling for a long, long time before I actually made the choice to leave. So it was certainly challenging, and it's a challenge a lot of officers, I think, face. Some of them, I think, know that they're done 100%, where a lot of them are more like me, where they are unsure. They feel like they want to leave, but they also know how much they love the profession and the brotherhood and sisterhood of law enforcement.
Is there a consistent statement that you're hearing when you're interviewing these officers? I think that a natural step for some officers would be to go into security.
Yep.
Right out of the public sector. But I'm imagining that you've talked to a wide range of folks, so you're getting a wide range of thoughts in terms of where they want to have their second career.
Yeah, I think one thing I really noticed, which is a little sad from my perspective, that so many of them feel like they can't be a good fit in the private sector, or that they're only able to be a good fit in the security or investigative type of roles. And if you want to be in investigative or security type of roles, that's awesome. That's a great career path. But I always tell officers, like, if you want to do it, fantastic, but don't think that's all you can do. There's so much more out there. So it is nice to see the officers who know, like, hey, I love technology. I want to get in the IT industry. Or, you know what, I really love working with people. Maybe being an HR manager could be useful. Or I love training. I can be some kind of corporate trainer as well. So it's been a little bit of a mixture of both, where some people have really cool ideas of where they want to go. But then still a lot of them just have no idea what's out there. And that's a huge thing I've noticed, is just the lack of knowledge these officers have of what's available to them in the private sector. And you don't just have to be, a security guard or security manager or a background investigator. There's so many different ways you can go. I mean, look at me. I went in the recruiting industry and then started my own business. So there's a lot of different ways you can go with it. And there's you should not feel that you're held back and just compelled to work in one industry or another. The sky really is the limit, and a lot of the skills that we learn in law enforcement translate phenomenally well to the private sector.
Do you have some kind of resource? This just makes me think of, like, when you're in high school and you take the, like, what career should you go for tests, and it kind of, like, gives you a range of different types of roles. Do you have any kind of resource that you give to the people that come to you to, like, help them maybe narrow down what they're looking
so
at?
that's a great question, and honestly, it's something I need to actually create, because I spend hours talking to officers one-on-one. So it's not a very efficient way of figuring them out what they want to do. But right now, it's a really one-on-one conversations where I get on the phone with them and ask them, so what was your favorite part of being a cop? What was your favorite part? And they'll talk about, one of them might talk about, dealing with people who are going through a difficult time. Others might talk about the technology side of things. Others might talk about the firearms. And I use that to then go further and talk about different careers that are available to them in the private sector. But that's a very much a one-on-one process, where coming up with an idea where you can really kind of see what you're a good fit for, like a test, like you mentioned, would be a really good idea. But to answer your question is not yet, but that's a great idea, though.
Trademark.
That's right.
Colin, when you're having those conversations with those officers, whenever I put in my notice and I told everyone that I was leaving, I had guys coming out of the woodwork to warn me not to do that. And They were like, man, you're going to lose your pension and you're never going to get benefits as good as this. And people are going to think you're a job hopper because you've only been here for 4 years, which now looks like forever.
Yep.
In today's climate. But like there was, and I recognized there was just all this fear around leaving law enforcement. And a lot of those guys, if they went to college, they majored in criminal justice, they came right out, they were a police officer, and it's all they've ever done. So it is scary. What are some of the biggest things that officers tend to be afraid of whenever they start to consider to make this leap?
Yeah, I know for me, I was told, like same similar to a lot of officers, told that this is a huge mistake. You'll be back. We'll see you in a year or so, or 6 months, you'll be back. I heard that probably 20 times from officers. So I went back a few months ago and visited some friends and say, hey, I'm still not back yet. I love the agency, but I'm still out. But yeah, I think a big fear people, a lot of officers have, from what I can see, is just the fear of the unknown, knowing that they're going to step out of a environment that they're relatively comfortable in, even though law enforcement is a very dangerous career path. We become very comfortable in that brotherhood and sisterhood. We know that the officers have our back. We know the general routine of being a cop. Going in the private sector, you lose all of that. You lose the camaraderie, you lose the government pension, you lose the government salary, the take-home cruiser. That was a big surprise for me, how much that affected me. There's a lot of things that you're going to lose and miss as well. And then just not knowing what the private sector will make of you. I went my very first day in the company I ended up joining. The very first thing they said, "Oh, you were a cop." Ooh, it's kind of weird, and kind of still, even though I wasn't anymore, they kind of still stood back a little bit and were a little bit hesitant about me. So that was definitely a feeling other officers have mentioned to me as well. That feeling of making that step and no longer being an officer and just being a regular civilian. It's a pretty difficult thing for a lot of people to address, especially the officers who've done it for 20 or 30 years. I felt a little bit of a culture shock after leaving after only 7 years. I can't even imagine what an officer who has done it for 3 decades would feel.
What about a lot of officers get into the role, and it's true for me, it's true for a lot of the officers that I've worked with, because of something they went through in their childhood, and it's their way of making the world a better place, and for something like healing them personally, and it's fulfilling to them. So how do you feel like you still get fulfillment in your roles outside of the police department?
Yeah, so that's why one big thing I talk about in the book, and also when I talk to my candidates as well, is just trying to don't just find a career just to get out of law enforcement or find a career that's safe. Try to find a career that you still have passion about. For me, I fell over backwards into this awesome industry and started my company where I'm actually now helping law enforcement officers and veterans with their transition. So for me, it's been amazing that I still feel connected to that industry, even though I'm no longer an officer. I still very much feel connected to that world and feeling I can make a difference in their lives and the lives of their families too. And I encourage my candidates to try to find something similar. Obviously, they don't all have to start a business or write their own book, but try to find a profession that you feel passionate about. Don't just settle for the first thing that comes along, or don't just settle for security or investigations if that's not something you're interested in. That's a big thing too. Is don't just do it for the paycheck. And that's something I realized too when I first left law enforcement. I joined a company that ended up not being a great fit. And I mentioned in the book several mistakes that I made during the process, because I think I was in a little bit of too much of a hurry to try to leave law enforcement, and then ignored some red flags from the company that I was joining. And definitely something I recommend for my candidates is take the time, make sure it's a company and an industry and a job that you really feel passionate about and believe that'll make a difference in your life, and one where you can also grow and make a difference for other people as well.
You spend a lot of time on concepts that might be considered job interviewing 101, right? Whether it's the resume or the application, or what the do's and don'ts, some of the pitfalls that you've seen. And I'm fascinated. One of the concepts that analysts seem to struggle with is this concept of marketing themselves. And I'm curious if you're finding the same thing with officers, which would surprise me in a way, because officers have to have certain soft skills in terms of communication, or when they're testifying, or when they're talking with somebody, or talking to somebody irate. It seems to me that they should have a easier time marketing themselves, but maybe that's not what you found out.
Yeah, so that's something I definitely would have thought of as well, that officers would do a really good job marketing and selling themselves. But what I found is so many officers who speak so fluently and confidently with me end up being very reserved and are very modest during their job interview. And that's probably the one place you don't want to be modest. You want to talk about what you've done and how well you've done in your career and what you could bring to a company. A lot of them kind of withdraw within and or give very basic answers, very generic answers, and feel because they're not talking to someone who could maybe understand what they've done, they try to minimize what they've done. And that's one thing I stress to them is even though the person you're interviewing with may or may not have ever been in law enforcement, you still want to try to express exactly what you've done and show how it correlates to what they do in the private sector and that your skills can really transfer and be a big benefit to that agency or that company.
So out of these skills, like you're having them making sure that they're selling them to the departments. We've talked a lot about soft skills versus analytical skills. What soft skills would you say are most important or to focus on or train up on, especially for analysts? I think that's something we often might forget about a little bit. We're really good at those technical skills. Is there anything you see specifically that needs to be out there?
Yeah, I think the ability just to communicate well during the interview, showing empathy, showing, work ethic, and just showing that you would be a great candidate for that company is a huge thing. What I found a lot of time in the private sector, unless the job is incredibly technical, a huge part of being selected to be hired is just the likability factor, whether or not the interviewer can connect with you and feel that you would fit in well with the company. If you show that you have the work ethic, you have the poise under pressure, and that you have the ability to learn, that's a huge thing for a lot of companies. And one thing I always stress for the clients I work with is that I place a huge emphasis on finding candidates that are good people and that are willing to learn. You can always teach somebody, the technical skills. You can't teach someone to be a good person. So really highlighting that and highlighting that background and how good of a candidate you can be and your work ethic and your communication. Those are the things that I think really shine with employers.
So we kind of talked about making the jump and the fear of making the jump, and is the job going to be fulfilling, and is the job are my skills going to translate, and am I going to lose my pension? I'm just curious, out of everyone that you've worked with, how many police officers make the transition to the private sector and a year later they're down the road and they're like, man, I really regret this, I should go back to the public sector?
So I can say I think 100% of my candidates I've worked with and placed myself are still with the companies they're with or still in the private sector. I don't think anybody has made a jump back into law enforcement, which is pretty interesting, because I know when I was a deputy sheriff, I saw people come and go numerous times. People would leave, go to either another agency or another profession even, and come back to law enforcement. But I'm seeing now that, especially the younger officers who are deciding they're done with being in law enforcement, a lot of them, as long as they make the transition successfully as far as finding a job, they then end up liking what they're doing and being very happy. I know for me, I was worried about the transition, worried about leaving, but it ended up being one of the best decisions of my life. Again, I love being a cop, but I'm just loving what I'm doing now as well.
So, two concepts that I remember hearing a lot when I was in the public sector is two things about the private sector. One is it seems like the private sector expects a lot of traveling. And depending on the position, that, you're leaving and now you're going to be away from the wife and kids or family long periods of time throughout the whole week. And number two, that you're getting into a cutthroat environment in which you could be laid off in 6 months, whereas you have more. The belief is you have more stability in the public sector. And so, can you talk a little bit about those two concepts? Do you still observe that type of fear, and what would you say to it?
Yeah, so a little bit. I definitely still see the second one for sure. The traveling, some officers obviously tell me I've been away from my family for a decade, 2 decades. I'm done with traveling. And fortunately nowadays, especially with the options of doing Zoom calls, team calls, traveling there's not as many jobs that require as much traveling, which is nice. There's still plenty, of course, that if you're interested in those kind of things, you can certainly do that as well. But there's also plenty of options where you don't have to travel. The risk of the layoffs is something I mentioned in the book as well, that in government, especially in law enforcement, unless you do something really egregious, you're pretty set. It's pretty tough to fire somebody who's following the general orders and following policies. Even if they're a jerk, they're not going to get fired. the private sector, especially how much you follow the private sector currently, the last 2 years, there's been a ton of layoffs, especially in the recruiting industry. I know a lot of great recruiters who lost their jobs, and a lot of them were out of work for 6 to 8 months. And that's something I definitely address in the book as well, is making sure that you factor that in and consider that. You're leaving a profession where employment stability is relatively stable. You're not going to get fired, most likely. Going to the private sector, there is that risk. You have to be prepared for something like that happening. And I always say, look at the company you're looking at as well. And that's something I didn't do. I didn't spend enough time researching the company that I ended up joining. And candidates that are doing that should go onto sites that give employee reviews. You can go to Glassdoor, you can go to Indeed. Those kind of companies websites allow employees, to leave reviews in those companies. And you can really see what the culture is like, if there is a cutthroat environment, if it's more of a happy environment, if there's career growth opportunities. And since those posts can be left anonymously as well, people are very honest. Because, when you interview with a company, they're going to tell you it's amazing, of course. But going onto those websites can really kind of open your eyes about what's going on in the company and if it's something you feel like it's a good fit. And then there's always a discussion too about whether you want to join a really big company, like a Facebook, a Meta, an X, and Amazon, or are you okay going to a smaller company? And typically, a lot of the bigger layoffs are with the bigger size companies that are, laying off, 10,000 people. So I joined a relatively small company, and like I said, there was pros and cons in that decision for sure, but definitely wasn't laid off, which is nice for me.
When you talk about the firing and the fact that in public sector it is a lot harder to get fired, which can, in my opinion, affect the culture that is within. So how do you feel the cultural shift is in being in the private sector versus the public sector?
Yeah, that's one thing. One of the factors why I ended up leaving law enforcement. I felt, even though I love my agency, I still speak really highly of them, and I thought it was a fantastic place to work. Probably similar to most agencies, it's a place where if you do really well, you're rewarded with more work. And it ended up just kind of, the better I did, the more work I got. And I kind of joke about now that the job that I was doing is now being done by 4 different people. And that's not an exaggeration. Literally 4 people are doing the job that I was doing when I was there. So that, then going to the private sector, if you're going to a good company, you can get rewarded with good work, with promotions, with raises, with bonuses and things like that. So that for me was appealing. And I think that can be an opportunity for a lot of officers who have great work ethic and have come from an environment where you get paid the same whether you're the hardest working officer in the agency or you're the biggest slacker who dodges all the calls. You're gonna get the same raise every single year, and that's something that definitely kind of irked me for a while. That I was getting the exact same raise as the officer next to me who was dodging calls, taking a nap in his cruiser, you name it. Versus in the private sector, there's potential if you do really well, you can also move up the ranks and financially as well as positions wise as well.
I always thought that both of those conversations, the cutthroat nature and the fact that you can be fired in the private sector, I always thought that those were kind of bizarre coming from police, because it's like, you're worried about the private sector being cutthroat. Bro, you put a gun on your hip and a steel plate over your chest every day. They sprayed you with poison in your training. They tear gassed you. They pepper sprayed. You got tasered.
Right. You got tased probably
in your training, and you're worried about like the cutthroat because Bob from accounting might send you a nasty email. Like you're worried about that. Like, and then if I go to the private sector, I can be fired. I was just like, yeah, and isn't that great? Like because there are so many great police officers out there, but every single police officer has worked with somebody who literally just collected a check for 30 years and did nothing. And everyone's just like, God, wouldn't it be so great if we could fire people? And so, yeah, like finding the right fit of the right company, like you're surrounded by people who, they're not corporate shills, they're high performers. And I think that makes you a higher performer too.
But yeah. So I saw when I went to the private sector, I kept the same work ethic that I had in law enforcement. And it seemed like within the first month, everyone was asking me, like, how are you doing all this much work? Like, you're kind of making us look bad. And it's like, this is how we work. And I always joke, my wife's a teacher, so I always joke with her that no one knows what hard work is like teachers and law enforcement. We get put through a lot, and we have to put up with a lot of crap and do a lot of work. That when I made that switch to the private sector, it just felt, at least the company I worked with, felt relatively easy. Like the workload I was getting was like, I want more. Like I'm ready to do more. So I don't think that fear of fear of getting let go, fear of layoffs should deter you by any means. That shouldn't be the only factor by any means. If you go and you perform it exceptionally well, you're not going to get laid off. Companies that really don't want to. If you're doing a good job, they want to keep you around and want you to continue to perform for them.
I'm curious, when your first, say week out of the being in law enforcement, did you have any sort of like identity crisis you felt was really hard to deal with? I know, like my first week being an analyst after being sworn, I checked for my gun like 50 times a day until I realized, wait, I didn't forget it. Like,
Right.
I don't have one anymore.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, I mentioned in the book as well, and I call it my gun belt day. So I've been out of law enforcement for probably about 4 weeks at the time, and really had not really thought too much about it. I was kind of like, oh, it's fine. I'm doing great. Like everything was going well, the job was going well. Hadn't thought too much about my prior career, and I just hadn't slept well the night before, and was getting dressed to go into my job for that day. And I was just putting my clothes on like I always do, just going through the motions, really, really tired, not even thinking about it. And after I put on all my clothes, I went and reached to the hook where my gun belt used to hang. And obviously the hook is no longer there, and the gun belt was definitely no longer there. So I really reached for nothing. And that moment, that's when it just really hit me that I was no longer, an officer, no longer a deputy sheriff. And it was rough. It was a tough day. I all of a sudden just like felt really, really sad and really kind of depressed about that fact that I was no longer in that profession. Even though I knew I had made the right decision to leave, it's still hard. It was definitely an identity crisis moment, and a really difficult thing to get through. That whole day was pretty brutal, and but it was funny that it was so much later. It wasn't like it was the first day after leaving law enforcement. The first 4 weeks were great. It was literally just a random Tuesday a month after leaving that it just hit me out of nowhere, and it was just that small act of reaching for my gun belt when it wasn't there that really made me realize I had left law enforcement forever.
When you went to the office and you think back about it now, what was there anything that really shocked you? Like you were leaving, obviously the fraternity of police and all the training that you did, and now you're really fish out of water per se, and you're going into this office job. Like thinking back now, like what was there something that really shocked you? Like I can't believe this goes on here, type of thing.
Yeah, so there are two things. The first one's a little funny. The very first thing I noticed that really blew me away was how much free stuff they were giving away. There were snacks and coffee and food everywhere. And it was just like, I was like, this is just for us? Like, yeah, help yourself as much as you want. Like, there were like these smoothies that were probably like $5 each. They had this fancy coffee machine. And like, I had to pay for everything I had in law enforcement. Like, my agency wouldn't give me a pencil if I needed it, right? So that was a huge shock. And then the second one for me was really just the lack of, at least the company I worked for, the structure of the company, where I came from an agency where the chain of command was a huge deal. A deputy would ask a sergeant, who would ask his lieutenant, who would ask his captain, all the way up to the sheriff, and then it would slowly work its way back down again. So getting an answer to a simple question could take weeks, right? And then with my first couple of weeks there, I was asking my supervisor what I thought was normal, appropriate questions to ask my boss, and he's like, "Colin, just go. We hired you to do this job. Just do it. As long as you're not going to destroy the whole company in this decision, go do it." And it took a little bit of adjustment, and not that I was afraid to make decisions. It was just that I'm so used to having to run a lot of these decisions by my superiors and having that freedom to really run with it. That was eerie at first, but then also very freeing once I got used to the idea too of just, if I think it's a good idea, I'm going to run with it. And that was one of my frustrations in law enforcement, was just that every decision had to go through 20 layers to get a decision, and then sometimes just because of the way government works, ideas couldn't be created, come to reality, and that was frustrating. Where in the private sector, if you have a good idea, for the most part, you can make it happen, which is pretty cool.
It's like Shawshank Redemption. Ask him to go to the bathroom.
Sorry, that's my puppy.
Right.
That's right. Well, exactly. Yeah. No. Yeah. You go whenever you want.
Now hold on. What's the dog's name?
So I have two dogs. So I have two Australian Shepherds. One's a 2-year-old. His name's Chunk from the Goonies. He came with that name, so we kept that. And then the other one's a puppy, which is the one barking, unfortunately. Her name's Keely. I'm a big soccer fan, so we watched Ted Lasso, and one of the characters in that show is Keely. So we have Keely here, and she's just as crazy as the Keely in the show. So it's perfect. Also very sweet, but also just nuts.
We'll post some pictures of the dogs with the show notes, I think.
Okay, perfect, awesome. I'll send them over to you for sure.
So, Colin, I want to ask you, what is, out of everyone that you've helped place in a job, what is the job that you've placed someone in that is the furthest removed from what we think of when we think of law enforcement?
Oh, that's a good question. Wow. Trying to put me on the spot now. It was it was very interesting. There's actually a company here in Ashburn, which is where I live, Ashburn, Virginia, and they do some really cool work. They work with diesel power generators, and they help keep facilities power running during like critical incidents. So they actually helped during Hurricane Katrina, and a few other things as well. And they were looking for a maintenance technician, and they really wanted somebody with quite a bit of experience in that world. But I found this officer who was moving to Northern Virginia who had never even thought about generators in his life. And I was like, listen, this guy, and I talked to him on the phone, and he was just so cool. Nicest guy ever, could really communicate well, was so eager to learn a new skill. And I sent his resume to them. And at first they're like, Colin, this guy has like, he's a great background, but nothing that we're interested in. But they ended up meeting with him because I kept pushing, like, this guy's awesome, you should talk to him. And they fell in love with him. And they hired him for a maintenance technician role working on generators. And I think now he actually supervises about 3 or 4 maintenance technicians, which is really cool. And it just shows just how versatile law enforcement officers are. And even though we may not have the exact skill that the company's looking for, we can learn it so quick. You know, the whole job of law enforcement is thinking on your feet and making quick decisions and dealing with the unknown. And he made that happen. And that was very cool. And I'm so happy that I sent that resume over, because I was going back and forth whether or not I should do it, just thinking like, they're going to say no. But luckily they took a chance, and it's nice to see companies that are willing to do that.
Absolutely. Well, Colin, thank you so much. The book comes out on July 2nd. If we're interested in picking it up, how can we get it?
Yeah, so you can either go to my website, which is whittingtonbooks.com, or go onto Amazon and just search Beyond the Thin Blue Line, and it'll be on there. I'm very excited, and hoping to also start pushing it towards law enforcement agencies as well. You know, when I left, they gave me a little plaque, which is nice and all, of course, but doesn't really do a whole lot as far as helping. So my thought was, if agencies can actually give their retiring or leaving officers a book that can actually help them, that would be great as well. So hoping agencies will pick it up too.
Awesome. Pre-orders now? Or got to wait till the 2nd?
Nah, maybe a week before. I'm still deciding whether or not to do pre-orders or not. The way the algorithm on Amazon is pretty weird. I'm hoping that it'll do pretty well, and we'll see. I'll let you know that if it comes pre-order, you'll be the first to know.
Well, I do really quickly want to plug that the Carolinas Crime Analysts Association is going to be doing a webinar on June 24th for analysts that are looking for private sector jobs, specifically for crime analysts. So if you are an analyst and you're listening and you want to learn more, order Colin's book and sign up for the CCAA webinar.
If you want to come for
webinar.
free,
See you on the
sign up to
24th.
be a CCAA member.
Well, Colin, thank you so much, and thank you all at home for watching, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you all.
Cheers.
Thank you all.